This video is sponsored by Archidekt, the #1 visual deck building website. Archidekt is an intuitive and powerful deck building platform tailor-made for Magic: The Gathering. Keep track of your collection, manage your decks, all with their gorgeous and user-friendly interface. Best of all, it's compatible with all constructed deck formats, from Commander to Modern to even Pauper. Be sure to head to archidekt.com/Tolarian for an introduction to the site and how it works, and we'll have more about them at the end of the video. Oh, hello! It's time to delve into the complete Sultai pre-constructed deck from Tarkir Dragonstorm. 2 brand new commanders, 10 total brand new exclusive card designs, and a host of exciting reprints, including a couple that have never been reprinted before. Presenting Sultai Arisen. In true Sultai fashion, Sultai Arisen is a graveyard deck built around self-mill and recursion. The deck has no trouble accruing an absurd amount of value, grinding your opponents to dust in the long game. And it does all this with a commander that takes the Sultai graveyard archetype in an exciting new direction. In this video, I'll be revealing the complete Sultai Precon with special attention paid to the 10 new cards as well as the most exciting reprints, but that's not all. I'll also provide you with some suggestions for the first upgrades that you should make to the deck after you pick up your copy. Please note, this video is not our usual Is It Worth It to Buy, but we will indeed be releasing that when all 5 commander decks hit the shelves. In the meantime, let's explore all that this deck has to offer and then discuss how we'd upgrade it to make it even better. Get ready to bug your opponents, huh? Bug them? Bug? If you get that joke, you're over 30, and make them Sultai when you play with this commander deck. The headliner for the deck is Tival, the Balanced Scale, the first explicit lands matter commander we've seen in Sultai colors. And of course, Tival wouldn't be Sultai if it didn't have some additional graveyard synergies attached. When Tival attacks, you'll mill 3 cards, then return a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Also, whenever 1 or more cards leave your graveyard, such as whenever Tival attacks, you'll create a 2/2 black zombie druid creature token. Tival comes with a nice 4/4 flying body and costs just 4 mana, which means it won't take long for your engines to start up. It doesn't trigger on entering play, only attacking, so you will need to untap with it before you start bringing back lands from your yard. Still, Tival the Balanced Scale does an excellent job tying together the graveyard, tokens, and lands matter synergies present in this deck. Your other option for the command zone is Cottis, Sibsig Champion, a 3-mana 3/3 zombie warrior legend that allows you to cast a creature from your graveyard once per turn by exiling 3 other cards from your graveyard, in addition to paying its other costs. Every time you do this, or find another way to bring a creature back to the battlefield from the graveyard, Cottis will get 2 +1/+1 counters. Each time you exile 3 cards from your graveyard to cast a creature with Cottis, you'll be triggering Tival twice. Once for the 3 cards exiled, and once for the creature spell entering the stack from the graveyard. You'll notice that both Tival and Cottis trigger when cards leave graveyards. If you were to therefore guess that the rest of the deck is made up of cards that move other cards into and out of the graveyard, well, you'd be right. In fact, many of the new cards in the deck are designed to do exactly that. Floral Evoker, for instance, can bring lands from your graveyard onto the battlefield by discarding creature cards from your hand. Each time you do this, you'll also trigger its landfall ability, adding a +1/+1 counter to your Evoker. The creatures you discard to Evoker can then be cast using Cottis's ability, making Floral Evoker an excellent synergy piece in Sultai Arisen. Steward of the Harvest is another incredible card. For 4 mana, it enters play and exiles up to 3 land cards from your graveyard. She then grants creatures you control all the activated abilities of land cards that have been exiled with this ability. If you exile a fetch land or a Terramorphic Expanse with this card, then all of your creatures, including your zombie tokens, can be sacrificed to fetch up a land from your deck. If you exile a huge mana generator, like say you slipped in your Gaia's Cradle, or you're just running Crypt of Agadeem, which comes in Sultai Arisen, you can start generating a ton of mana off of each creature you control. And funniest of all, if you put in a strip mine, or I suppose a ghost quarter, if you only want to be kind of mean, you can start machine gunning down your opponent's lands with each creature you control. Pew, pew, pew! That's me doing finger guns. Of course, if you go too crazy with that move, you'll find yourself in bracket 4. Another way to exile cards from the graveyard is with Snapcaster Mage style effects. No, Snapcaster Mage isn't in this deck list, but a new card called Diviner of Mist is. 5 mana for a 4/5 flying dragon that casts cheap spells from the yard for free when it attacks. It also mills 4 cards before you choose a spell to cast, meaning even if you don't have a spell in the yard, you still might hit one in the top 4 cards of your library. So not only does Diviner of Mist trigger Tival when it exiles the spell it wants to cast, but it also fuels the rest of your graveyard synergies through self-mill. Welcome the Dead is a 4 mana card draw spell that's also capable of generating a ton of zombie druid tokens. If you cast it post-combat after attacking with your Tival and milling 3 to its trigger, you'll make at least 4 zombies. Oh, and it has flashback, which means you either get 2 bites at the apple, or you can simply mill it over with one of the many self-mill enablers in Sultai Arisen. And if you mill it over with Diviner of Mist, you'll get to cast it for free and make a minimum of 5 2/2 zombies. Will of the Sultai is another installment in the cycle that brought us Jeska's Will. This one is a much more powerful, splendid reclamation for just 1 more mana than its predecessor. It's a modal spell, but you get to pick both modes if you control a commander. Target player mills 3, then returns all lands from your graveyard to the battlefield, or put X +1/+1 counters on a creature, where X is the number of lands you control. It gains trample until end of turn. When you're able to choose both modes, they'll resolve from top to bottom, which means all your lands will enter play before your creature gets swole. All those lands entering play also means a lot of landfall triggers, so a Floral Invoker in play will give you a massive attacker out of nowhere. Colossal Grave Reaver is an absurd reanimation engine that costs an arm, a leg, and most of a torso, but the payoff is considerable. A 7/6 flying dragon that mills 3 cards when it enters or attacks, and anytime you put 1 or more creature cards into your graveyard from your deck, you pick one to put directly into play. So yes, this is an 8 mana card, but because it mills the turn it comes down, it gets you value right away. Especially if you have additional ways to mill on that turn as well. Cast it pre-combat and then attack with Tival to mill 3 cards, and return a creature that you mill over to play, which of course will give you a 2/2 from Tival. The deck's commanders aren't the only cards that care about cards leaving the graveyard. Tival's Judgment is templated like the powerhouse artifact from Aetherdrift, Monument to Endurance, except that Tival's Judgment is an enchantment instead of an artifact, and tracks when cards leave your graveyard instead of when you discard cards. The first 2 modes on Tival's Judgment are the same as its predecessor, but the third mode makes zombies instead of making opponents lose life. Just like Monument to Endurance, this is a phenomenal card in any deck capable of triggering it, which is something that Sultai Arisen can do with ease. The last new card is another massive spell, though this one can cost as little as 3 mana if you have plenty of cards in your yard to delve away. Afterlife from the Loam. I get that reference. A mass reanimate spell that returns a creature from each player's graveyard to the battlefield under your control, triggering, you guessed it, both Tival and Kottis. In fact, Afterlife from the Loam triggers Tival twice. Once when you pay its delve cost, and once when you reanimate a creature from your own yard. As if reanimating up to 4 creatures for 3 mana wasn't exciting enough. It literally took 20 years to find out what comes after Life from the Loam, but wow was it worth the wait. Speaking of Life from the Loam, well, how about Life from the Loam? Sultai Arisen includes Afterlife from the Loam's famous predecessor, complete with gorgeous new art. Life from the Loam is an incredible inclusion here, as it's a card that has only been reprinted a couple of times in Magic's history, and never before in a Commander product. And of course, Life from the Loam isn't the only exciting reprint in this precon. One of the most powerful win conditions for lands decks in Commander receives a sorely needed reprint, and that's Ob Nixilis the Fallen. Poor Ob lost his spark years ago, then reignited it, then lost it again during the events of March of the Machine. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy, planeswalker, demon, psychopath. He does fantastic work in this deck regardless, getting bigger and sapping your opponent's life each time a land enters. This was a sorely needed reprint as of the time of this recording, so I'm so glad to see it included in Sultai Arisen. Another great reprint in this deck is Dauthi Voidwalker, a phenomenal graveyard hate card that can also steal your opponent's spells. Sacrifice it to cast a spell at exiled, then replay it using Cautis to do the same whole dance again the following turn. Your opponents will love you, or the other thing. The deck also includes Conduit of Worlds, the bigger and stronger Crucible of Worlds, and this is actually its first ever reprint. Remember, making land drops from your graveyard triggers both Tival and his Judgment. Hedron Crab is another card that's receiving its first reprint outside of the list in Sultai Arisen. This ultra-efficient 1-mana spell will be targeting yourself with its landfall ability every single turn. It's another phenomenal reprint included in the deck. Though Tival does enable landfall synergies, it's best to view this precon as a graveyard deck first and a landfall deck second. The 99 does a great job supporting the graveyard plan with plenty of self-mill, graveyard recursion, and even a smattering of sacrifice. Wonder is a phenomenal card to mill over while doing other stuff, giving all your creatures flying, including Tival's zombie tokens. Escaping Woestrider from your graveyard triggers both Tival and Cautis, as does both casting Gravecrawler and activating Reassembling Skeleton. Several of the self-mill effects in this deck are very low in terms of mana cost, so it won't take long to start fueling your Graveyard Matters cards. Stitcher's Supplier, for instance, can be cast on turn 1 to start your engines running on the very first turn of the game. On top of its self-mill, Grapple with the Past can rebuy any of your big creatures that your opponents may have destroyed throughout the game. If you're not milling yourself in the early game, you're probably ramping with the nearly dozen cheap ramp spells in the deck, several of which also help to trigger your landfall effects. At the top end, we've got several heavy hitters, some of whom don't often show up in Commander precons. Consuming Aberration can get very huge very fast, especially considering the limited graveyard hate Commander players tend to bring. And if you don't believe me, be sure to see Aberration in all its glory in our jank episode of Shuffle Up and Play with Pleasant Kenobi and the guys from One More Mana. That video is linked here or in this video's description. The deck also includes a few classic commanders in Sultai colors. Cards like Tasigur, Meren, and Jared Golgari Lich Lord. If you're looking for a more throwback experience, you can run Tasigur in the command zone, as many of the same cards that are great with Tival at the helm are still great when Tasigur claims his rightful place on the Sultai throne. The Sultai Wedge has never had any trouble with removal spells, whether they be versatile spot removal or sweepers. Sultai Arisen is no exception, with great removal spells all up and down the curve, including a nice reprint of Lethal Scheme, which itself can help set up some of your graveyard shenanigans through conniving. Amphin Mutineer is an awesome card to mill over thanks to its encore ability, which triggers, say it with me folks, Tival's 2/2 zombie ability. And of course, no Sultai deck is complete without a copy of Treasure Cruise, an amazing card first printed in the original Cons of Tarkir, just missing its iconic watermark. Finally, Sultai Arisen includes 2 new cards from the main Tarkir Dragonstorm set. Essence Anchor, a card selection engine that will start pumping out 2/2 zombie druids pretty quickly once your deck starts moving, and Kishla Skimmer, a 2-mana flyer that draws you cards once per turn when a card leaves your graveyard. So that's the full deck. It's both playable and quite powerful right out of the box, but maybe you want to take it to the next level. Well, the landfall and graveyard themes make it easy to do so. You can actually ratchet this precon up a bracket or 2, and I want to show you how. Let's open up Architect and take a look at upgrades. So after uploading the Sultai Arisen deck list to my Archidect account, you can see how the site automatically groups the cards in the deck into different categories, such as ramp, removal, win conditions, and recursion. I can also group the deck by mana value or card type. When working with a new precon list, I like to group the deck by mana value first to get a sense of what my curve looks like. You can specify that you only want to sort the spells, which is important to do, because lands and 0 mana spells should be in a different different stack. If spells can be cast for a different mana cost than their mana value would suggest, such as delve spells like Afterlife from the Loam and Treasure Cruise, you can manually edit their mana cost by clicking on the arrow that appears on the card when you hover over it with your mouse, and then clicking Custom CMC on the right. There's truly so much you can customize with Architect. You can adjust the card printing to reflect the actual card you own or that you intend to buy. As is always the case with precons, Sultai Arisen includes some very cool and flavorful cards that are unfortunately too weak, overcosted, or off-plan to make the cut once we start making upgrades. These are the first cards we'll be looking to replace. Consuming Aberration, for instance, does not help us with the Graveyard Recursion or Landfall plan. Necropolis Fiend is a bit slow and eats our graveyard too quickly to be effective. Reassembling Skeletons synergizes with our plan, but it's too low impact to make the final cut. Woe Strider is a nice sacrifice outlet, but that's not something the deck needs much of. We're also cutting a couple of tap lands, and unfortunately for Crypt of Agadeem, we just often won't have enough black creatures in our graveyard to make the card worth running. Let's add a to-cut tag to these cards. I like using red for my to-cut tag, but you can choose whatever color you want. For ads, we're going to add cards to the maybe board first to get a picture for what's coming in. We're going to include more self-mill enablers and a few additional payoffs for both lands and graveyard recursion strategies. Ripples of Undeath and Six are both great for triggering Teval's second ability. Insidious Roots is very easy to trigger in this deck, especially in tandem with Meren or Muldrotha, the latter of which we're also adding to the deck. I definitely want to add in an Elixir of Immortality, as it's a good way to save your graveyard from any hostile Bojuka Bogs your opponents may bring to the table. I've also added a pair of cards that combine exceptionally well with Teval. Titan's Nest, which can make zombies at will with Teval's second ability, and Altar of Dementia, a ridiculous self-mill enabler that loves to eat the zombie tokens Teval makes. If you have all three cards in play, then each zombie you create off of Titan's Nest can be sacrificed to the altar to generate fodder for 2 additional zombies. Now, this isn't infinite, at least not without adding a Gaia's Blessing or shuffling Eldrazi Titan to your deck, but it does make a massive board of zombies which can be fed to the altar to make your opponent's mill instead. Lastly, we've added 3 lands that work well with the graveyard theme: Ghost Quarter, Fabled Passage, and Blighted Woodland. Remember, Ghost Quarter and Fabled Passage are great lands to exile under your Steward of the Harvest. Now that we have all these lands in the maybe board, let's start adding them to the main deck and cut the cards we marked to cut. As for the new cards we add, let's give them a new additions tag so that we can keep track of recent changes. As these cards prove themselves, we can untag them, and as we make new changes, we'll tag those as well. At the end of the day, while this is not my Is It Worth It to Buy video, I do still feel confident in saying that this is a really impressive precon, and I'm not just saying that because I got to preview it. It's a flexible deck that handles the themes of landfall well, graveyard recursion fairly, and self-mills consistently. On top of all of that, it contains a mix of splashy new legendaries, and its featured Sultai commander explicitly cares about lands, a rare archetype to be offered in these colors, especially as a precon. This really is an exciting precon, a precon that once picked up has fun and interesting lines to follow and can be upgraded to become an absolute menace to your pod in higher brackets. There really isn't much more you could even ask for in a precon. I mean, except that it include the Battle Bond lands, but Nonetheless, I hope very much this deck reveal and upgrade guide has been of some use to you. Remember that our upgraded deck is linked via Architect in this video's description, so head to architect.com/Tolarian for an introduction to the site and how it works, and thank you Architect for sponsoring this video.
Next time on Shuffle Up and Play.
What's up? It's Shuffle Up and Play with decks that Tomer has built for us. Tomer built the entire pod for how much money, Tomer?
$25 each, so total $100.
Do you notice how he built the decks for all of us? And he the one
I did notice that.
Did not rig it.
It looks kind of sus, Tomer.
This isn't petty prof anymore. It's proper play prof. All the P.
So much PP.
So much PP.
He's showing weakness. Get him.
You've played your last shambling ghast.
Because it's commander, yeah.
Yes, correct.
That's am I going to win next turn type face.
Oh, God, no. You didn't build it that good.
He just called you a zoomer. You gonna take that?
You know, because of that, I'm gonna swing at prof.